everyone, this is Alex Gosse, owner of Magically Resin and working in collaboration with Craft Resin to bring you so many wonderful tips and hints and ideas for how to use your craft resin better. This week I'll be teaching you how to make this beautiful piece. I love working with craft resin when you know you're going to be doing a mold that has a lot of intricate inlay, and it's just so fantastic. The low viscosity gets in all the spaces that you wanted to get in. It's really easy to work with. So I dust molds often that have these beautiful intricate inlays, and I really love color shift, and I'm going to show you how to do that. This mold that I'm working with is from Shop Resin Molds, and I really love the quality of the molds that they provide, and often they have these fantastic inlay designs. So you'll find a lot of the projects that I use Shop Resin Molds in conjunction with Craft Resin, and I think that is a powerful starting point. I will list all of the things that I use in this tutorial today in the description below so that you can easily try to recreate this if you want, or to play with the idea and try something different. I would love for you to reach out on my social media and show me the things that you've decided to do or the inspiration you found from any of my pieces. You can find me at Magically Resin on Instagram and really everywhere. So look me up and tag me or collaborate with me and let me know what you're working on. I'm super excited to know. Here I've dusted the center of the sunflower mandala with a gold color shift, and it'll be much more apparent after the piece is poured when you can see how vibrant that color shift is. And I like using color shift that are chrome in addition to color shift that I call mermaid. I'm not sure what they actually call them, but the difference is one is reflective and one you can see through. And I knew that I was going to be adding an inlay to this of a product that I make and sell in my Etsy shop that is reflective. So I wanted my inlay to show through the outside part, and I'll explain that when I get there. What I've added to the rim is alcohol ink with mica powder in it. I do this technique all of the time, and I have not found a mica powder that this doesn't work with. So some of them are prettier than others because some colors are prettier than others. I'm adding a little dot of this to each of those dots in the inlay, just this particular circle. So this mica powder is a very reflective gold, and I think that that will be really pretty just in just a few spots. I want it to really stand out and be prominent. So it takes a minute for the alcohol ink to dry, and because I don't want it to leave the reservoir that is the outside edge, I'm not going to blow it until I believe that it's dry enough that it isn't going to move around too much. So I do this technique all the time when you have a mold that has a built-in reservoir and you want it to be a particular color. I don't find this technique good with color shift. If y'all could fill in the comments if you have a way to make color shift a liquid and to use it that way, I would be thrilled to know that. But I have not found a way except using it with a brush and painting it right on. So let me know how y'all use your color shift. I would be thrilled to try some new ideas, or if you want to see me try something. So now I'm doing the same technique. I use my mat for basically as a palette. And because alcohol ink with mica in it, once it dries, is just going to sit on the palette. And when you add alcohol back to it, it's ready to go. So I do this gold technique often enough that it has a prominent place right on my workstation. And when it's dry, it doesn't hurt anything. And it can easily be picked up with alcohol ink, or if I actually want to pour some resin right onto that to pick up the whole thing, the resin will pick up the color and will pick up the design. I'm using a silicone brush that has a very fine pointed tip, And what I'm doing is I'm making sure that the mix that I have is very heavy mica with just a little bit of alcohol in it to make it able to move it around. And I'm getting a droplet on the edge of the silicone paintbrush, we'll call it. And all that I want is basically just one droplet to drop into the reservoir, and then I move it around just a little bit so that it doesn't go outside. So I'm very careful not to have very much liquid on the tip. And I frequently find it very useful to have a flashlight available for me when I'm doing something like this. I have a very bright workstation, but I like the localized brightness of a flashlight for lots of things. Very useful for doming. So for this particular job, I found the flashlight to be very helpful. At this point, I feel like the alcohol is dry enough that I can use the heat gun very carefully and make sure and blow it to where it's pushing into the side instead of into the center. And I can dry it up some so that I can see if there are spaces where the mica is too thin around the edge. And I'm wanting to move on to the next part. And it's very important before you move on to the next part that all of your alcohol ink is dry, at least where you will be dusting. For this part, I'm using a complementary color shift that I thought would be really pretty against the gold of the center, and this is also a reflective color shift. So what I wanted was the entire sunflower in the center to be some level of reflective. And now here I'm using all the center is done with color shift that I call chrome, that I think is frequently called chrome, and it's reflective. So what I'm doing here on the outside is I'm using a color shift that I call mermaid. That refers to how it works, not the color. So this is not reflective. This, you will be able to see the inlay that I embed, and I want that to be the case. So there's basically 3 different types of reflection that are going to happen on the mandala. You've got the mica that is going to be very bright gold molten reflection. And then you have the 2 color shifts in the center that are going to be a chrome reflection. And then you have this outside layer that is going to be a see-through color shift mermaid. If y'all know what this is actually called, that would be great. I'm sure people that do nail painting and stuff know whatever the terminology is, because there's 2 very different types of color shift, and I think both are lovely depending on what you're doing. And it's important to know which type you're using, because often what you put behind it will make a big difference in how it works as well. Very often, if you're doing the reflective part in the center, what you want is a solid black behind it so that you get a really good mirrored chrome. And when you're doing the mermaid, the best thing to go behind that is a white. It gives it a very opalescent effect, like an iridescent opalescent effect. I didn't show this on camera, but it is very important when you're doing any type of mold dusting to make sure often and in between each color that you pick up the mold and you vigorously shake it or knock it off on something so that all of the powder that's sitting inside of it will fall out. Because once you start pouring your resin, you do not want your resin to pick up any of the colors that were from the dusting, or you might muddy the whole thing. I have prepared my resin off camera. There are many videos on Craft Resin that show you in depth how to prepare craft resin and all of the specifications that are important. And what I was showing you with the thinness of the resin is this was part A and B that had not been mixed yet, and it was incredibly thin. And I find that super important when I'm doing something like this mandala that's very intricate. I want A and B to be very warm before I mix them together. And then, of course, they'll stay very warm as you pour it into the mold. So I use a hot water bath to make sure that my resin is really nice and warm before I even measure it out and mix A and B together. So you see, it's water thin before I start anything at all. And I think that is really the most important tip for successful resin use. I can't really speak to many other resins because every resin is really different. But I pour craft resin, I have 3 or 4 pours per day, every day, for a long time. And I love this product. I think it is so consistent. And part of me is definitely a scientist or an engineer, something in between. And I love the consistency of this product. It always is beautiful and bubble-free, crystal clear, and it always hardens just perfectly. So now I've mixed it for the allotted time, which is also, I never do mention this, but I have arthritis, and it's easier to mix it when it's warm. It's more effective to mix it when it's warm. And also, the low viscosity of craft resin is so easy on my hands, where lots of other resins that I've tried are thick when you're mixing them, and they make my hands hurt. So the low viscosity is a win in a million different ways for me, but that is something I don't really touch on that I really had trouble with and struggled with before I found craft resin, and now my hands never hurt from mixing these up. I am now embedding an inlay that I pre-cut, that I make myself and that I sell in my Etsy shop. And my objective with this, my hope with all of this, is that you watch one of my videos and you feel empowered to make something beautiful. And I've found that resin I'm able to create things that are prettier than I should be able to make, that it feels like with just a few ingredients, and now I have a lot more knowledge, but even early, I felt so empowered by resin because it's just so pretty that if you have a mold and you have good resin and you add just a little bit of color and maybe an inlay, it's gold. So my objective in so many things is to give y'all the knowledge to feel powerful and try something new, and to provide you with things that I found elevate a piece and make it very different than other people's pieces. And just by adding an inlay, you change the entire, you'll see when this is done, and maybe from the beginning, this reflective piece with texture added an entirely new element that even I couldn't quite capture on camera. It gave layer and depth to this beautiful piece that's really, really evident underneath the mermaid, in air quotes, part of the piece. When I'm embedding any inlay, especially one that isn't rigid, usually I use inlays that are rather rigid and it makes it easier, but it wouldn't have been for this piece because of the mandala aspect, because of the texture on the bottom. So I like to lay it in an angle to minimize the air pockets underneath it. And then I'm holding it stationary with a silicone mold so that I don't want to get my gloves all sticky if I don't have to. A silicone mold works perfectly for this. So I'm holding it stationary and I'm pushing I'm not pushing out the air, I'm pushing out the resin underneath it, because there's no air underneath it because of the way I laid it down. But I want it to be very, very close to the base, and I want it to be covered with resin, because I'm going to do a special trick here in just a minute that might just change your life. So this piece might want to float, and I do not want that to happen. And not only do I not want that to happen, but I really want the silver reflective to sit completely flat against the mandala aspect on the bottom, so that visually it looks very reflective. It doesn't look like there's any curves, like a mirror, being very flat. So what I'm going to do, and what you see me here with, is sawdust. I am going to mix some sawdust with some resin, and I'm doing this for a wide variety of reasons. First, I want to add weight to this piece. So you'll see when I lay on the sawdust, you could use sand for this too, but I have sawdust, and it also produces a much more opaque result, which for me matters because the inlay that I'm using is, while you can't tell that the silver reflective inlay is transparent, it is. So now, after all of this is laid down, what I want to do is put a dark backing on all of it so that the reflective, first I want to flatten the reflective piece so that it's sitting totally flat on the bottom of the mandala, completely under the resin, because it might float, and also I want it to be flat like a mirror. So I'm using the sawdust as a weight. I'm also using it as an opaque provider so that there's no light that will come through. And I'm mixing it into the resin that was already in the piece because I don't want to overflow the piece by adding too much of the sawdust. So I'm moving from the center out so that the sawdust will mix in as I move out and around. My phone died at this point, so I lost just a little bit of footage, but basically I keep doing the same thing, mixing sawdust to resin, and then adding it in pieces so that I can get the thickness that I want. And now I'm spraying it with isopropyl alcohol. I really like a 91 or higher percentage, but you can get away with 70 if you're very familiar with alcohol and how to use it. And absolutely never, never, never use a torch after you've sprayed any type of alcohol spray or after you've used any type of alcohol ink. So I noticed that my Pinata alcohol ink I was having a tough time getting it to come out. Look how smooth that is. So all that I did, I keep a pen on hand always in my work area, and I have a pen that I just stick in the top of any alcohol ink or any needle-nosed anything. I use needle-nosed bottles all the time. So I want this alcohol ink to be very, very loose because I want it to cover the entire back of the piece. And I did something here on purpose that is a problem and will cause a problem because I thought it'd be a really good teaching moment, and it's the back of a piece, so I wasn't concerned that this would cause a problem for me. But what I did here was I left a lot of the alcohol straight from the bottle sitting on top. And what can happen when you do that is it can cause the alcohol ink to create a skin. So whenever you're doing anything with alcohol ink, it is important to make sure that it gets underneath the resin quickly, but especially if you're working with black and white because of the nature of how they're made. Black and white are opaque, the Pinata at least is, versus the other colors that are going to just go in the resin. So if you're working with black or white Pinata alcohol ink, it is important to make sure that if you just put it right on top of resin, that you press it down some so that the resin lands on top of it. So you'll see that I left a bunch of alcohol ink on this side without doing anything to it for a really long time. And you'll see here in a minute what happens when you do that. So I thought it would be a good teaching moment as to what not to do on something where it wouldn't really affect the piece that I was making, because all that I'm doing with this alcohol ink is I'm making the piece more opaque and giving it a black background so that the reflection will be the most reflective that it can be. So here you can see that it's starting to create a skin, and the alcohol ink, where I didn't do anything to it and I just put the heat gun on it, and even if I hadn't done the heat gun, this would still have happened, that each of these parts of the alcohol ink just floating on the top creates their own skin. So this is a perfect example of what not to do with alcohol ink, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to show y'all that. And you'll see even at the end that they're really patchy. And now you know when you see something like this happen, that patchiness if you used alcohol ink, see the patchiness that's happening, that is absolutely why. So if you drop black alcohol ink right on top of resin, whether you use a heat gun or not, you are going to get these black, waxy, patchy spots. So you can see here how a little bit of how the center is reflective. You'll see it much better in better lighting. But what you can really see here is how the reflective inlay that I added, you can see behind the mermaid. And I am ecstatic with how this turned out. I think that, because this was an experiment for me, and I love, you can see the texture, the dotted texture of the reflective inlay. And now you can really see the difference of where the parts that are reflective and the inlay depth reflection. So I'm pretty tickled with how this turned out. I guess, everybody who knows me knows that I'm pretty silly and I really like my pieces, especially when I try something new and it gives a cool effect. You can see the depth inside of the piece, and I am in love with this idea. So this is why I make the inlays. I make them for me. And then I've had so many people that want them that I throw them up in my shop. But that depth that is added by that dotted inlay to this already very pretty piece, first of all, adds a unique thing that this piece is yours. You decided on an inlay that you chose for that. It's an additional element that I absolutely love. And I think that when you have something such pretty depth already in a mold, but then you add a whole nother layer, I feel like that elevates something to just a whole nother dimension of beauty. I thank you so much for sharing your precious time with me. I am so thrilled to share all these fun tips and ideas. I would love to hear your feedback, anything you might want to see me do, any projects that you're interested in. Feel free to reach out to me on all of my social media. I want to see what projects you're doing. If you're inspired by me, I live for that. So reach out to Magically Resin everywhere that I am. Reach out to Craft Resin. They are such a great company, and they want to hear your feedback and what you think about their product and how you're using their product. So thank you so much and have a fantastic day.